Today we're going to talk about causes of the American Civil War. It's a fascinating time in American history. World War II and the Civil War seem to be the two big topics that people really get interested in when they start digging into history. And everybody wants to know why. And it's a valid question. Why in the world did we have a war, American versus American, where we killed over 700,000 of each other? It must be pretty bad in order for us to do something so terrible. And I'm going to try to keep this short, but I can't promise anything. I'm going to get excited and keep rambling. But if you're talking about a cause of the Civil War, it's hard to say that there's just a cause. Almost any good fight doesn't just start with one thing. I can think back to when I was a kid and the time I had a huge fight with my brother, and I got the worst whipping of my life because I was chasing him around the yard trying to hit him with a bat. And what started it was he hit a home run in a game of wiffle ball, and it made me really angry. But it wasn't just that home run that caused me to chase him around the yard with a bat. It was the 25,000 other home runs he had hit. It was 5 years of never winning a game against him. It was all those times he held me down and dangled spit over my face and then sucked it back up most of the time. Years and years of anger boiled over until I finally chased him around with a bat, and my dad got mad and whipped me with a switch. Well, it's the same thing with the Civil War. These arguments had been brewing for a long time. They had been brewing since after the American Revolution. When we talked about the Constitution, there were arguments between North and South. I will tell you, there was one thing that more than anything caused this argument. And James Madison talked about it in the Constitutional Convention. He said, it's not going to be large states versus small states that causes a problem here. It's going to be North versus South. The interests of the northern states versus the interest of the southern states. And there was one interest in particular he was talking about. Thomas Jefferson, also very early, saw this coming, and he said, the rock upon which our nation will split is the issue of slavery. So if there's one big defining issue, of course, it's the issue of slavery that drives this fight between North and South. Will we have slavery or will we not have slavery? But it's never that easy. It's always much more complex than that. So we're going to start looking at some of those other factors. I'm going to talk about those and try to give you a better picture of why these two groups, the blue states, were taking on the gray states. The blue is the North. You might hear them called the Union or the Yankees. The gray is the South, the Confederates, the rebels, all kinds of different names. They call Northern soldiers Billy Yank and Southern soldiers Johnny Reb, all kinds of different names. It means the same group of people. And the red states you can see on the map here, those are called border states. And we're going to get more in detail with those later. But Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were states where slavery was legal, but they never joined the Confederacy. They stayed loyal to these blue states throughout the war. And almost everything Abraham Lincoln did as president was calculated to make sure these states did not leave the Union. You may notice a new state here, West Virginia. West Virginia, you can see in the notes, broke away from Virginia in 1863 to join the Union. It's a mountainous part. This was part of Virginia all the way up to 1863. It's kind of ironic. This mountainous area of Virginia, there wasn't a lot of demand for enslaved people to do labor. So they were not as excited about joining everyone else and joining the Confederacy. So after these southern states had seceded from the Union, this part of Virginia seceded from Virginia and formed a brand new state. It's the only state we had during the Civil War. So let's look at some of these other causes. Spoiler alert, if you look down at the bottom here, slavery is the cause. But I want to look at all these things together. Let's talk about states' rights, because if you ever hear people talk about the Civil War, the second most popular thing they say, is the cause of the Civil War, is this idea of states' rights. The idea that the South believes states should have more power and that states had a political right to secede, to break away from the country. It's rooted in the Declaration of Independence. When government no longer meets your needs, you have the right and the responsibility to overthrow that government and make a new one. The North believed in a strong federal government. They believed secession was unconstitutional. This goes back to Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, this argument way back during the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. This isn't a new argument. There was always an argument over the role of government. I will tell you this, if you read literature from that time period, people talking about going to war and why they want to go to war, there's some documents I'm going to share with you later in the week. They're called Declarations of Secession. Just like we had a Declaration of Independence from Britain during the American Revolution, these southern states wrote Declarations of Secession. Basically, they're declarations of independence. None of them really dove into this idea of states' rights, except as it relates to slavery. The states' rights to own or make laws that allow people to own other people. So the big states' rights argument comes after the Civil War, when people are trying to figure out, how could we have done this? This was so wrong. I can't believe we fought a war and killed 700,000 of each other for the right to own other people. Well, all of a sudden, the states' rights argument starts to come up, but you don't really see it in any of the letters or diaries or anything like that until after the Civil War. The economies are definitely different, for sure. Southern states mostly rely on agriculture. They don't feel like there's a lot of industry or a lot of need for industry in the southern states. They made their money off plantation crops, but they felt the government was always favoring northern industry at the expense of southerners through tariffs, taxes on imported goods. Well, here's the thing. In 1832, when Andrew Jackson was president, there was a tariff that was passed, the Tariff of Abominations, they called it. And South Carolina almost seceded then. But Andrew Jackson sent troops to South Carolina and he squashed that rebellion. Since that time in 1832, almost all those tariffs were written by Southerners. And the most recent one before the war started was in, I think, 1857 or 1858. The tariff was lower than it had ever been, and it was written by Southern senators. So to blame it on the tariff like some people do, probably not what we're looking at for a major cause. If we had a war in 1832 over the tariff, yeah, I might agree with that. But by 1860, it wasn't such a big deal. Oops, sorry. In the North, there's a lot of factory workers, a lot of immigrants, and it's, I guess, a common misconception that the North is all industry and the South is all agriculture. That's just not true. So another thing that kind of shoots that argument in the foot over the economy being the big cause or differences in the economy is, think about Ohio. In 1860, about 96 to 97% of people living in Ohio were farmers. And if it was a war between farmers and factory workers, Ohio would have joined the South. So would almost every other state in the Union, because in 1860, the number one occupation in every state was farmer. So it's not just a war about farmers versus industry, although those jealousies do rise up and cause some tension between the North and the South. I'm going to skip this one for a second. I'm going to look at the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists, people who wanted to end slavery. Up until the 1830s, most people were not abolitionists. The abolitionist movement starts to gain steam in the 1830s. And by the 1850s, with that book I talked to you about, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the abolitionist movement was real. They had a lot of people in it. It was getting stronger. They were speaking out against the evils of slavery. These abolitionists are 99% located in the North, and the South hated them. They believed that these abolitionists were going to cause slave rebellions, which they might have. That's true, where the enslaved people would realize on a plantation they totally outnumber the white people on the plantation, the owners and the overseers, and they had the tools to lead a rebellion. You could use those farming tools to overwhelm the people who were claiming ownership of you if you wanted to lead a physical rebellion. And some people did. They were usually put down by the army pretty quickly, but some people did that. And the Southerners were really afraid of these abolitionists. In the North, abolitionists at first were seen kind of as crazy lunatics on the fringe, but they gained popularity over the decades. Finally, in the North, there's a guy named John Brown, who we're going to talk about a little bit later in this slideshow and a little bit later in another one later in the week. He used violence to try to end slavery a couple of different times, and he was a major player in why we fight the Civil War. Slavery, the way people feel about slavery, it evolved over time. In the South, in the beginning, it was seen as a necessary evil, something that people didn't really like. And I'm talking about around the time of the Revolution and Thomas Jefferson, something people didn't like, but they didn't quite know how to get rid of it. The North, for the most part, they didn't own slaves because the climate and the jobs that people were doing, the growing season is short. And so there wasn't a need for other people to do their work. The South felt like they had a need for other people to do their work. They felt like they were treating slaves well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. To me, the big issue is the expansion of slavery. It's not just slavery itself, it's the expansion of slavery. And we've talked about how the United States was growing, Manifest Destiny, going from sea to shining sea. We did the interactive map where we kept adding territory. Well, after 1820, every time we added territory, we had to have a major argument in the Senate about how we were going to treat slavery in the new territories. During the American Revolution, when Continental Congress was in charge, we added the Northwest Territory under the Articles of Confederation. And the founders, I told you, a lot of them didn't like slavery, but they didn't know how to end it. Well, they wanted to end it by containing it and hoping it would just go away. So they did not allow slavery into the Northwest Territory. In 1820, we've had enough people move west of the Mississippi after Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase. Missouri wanted to become a state. The problem with Missouri becoming a state is it was going to throw off the balance of power in the Senate between states that allowed slavery and states that didn't. So we had a compromise in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri enters as a slave state, but to keep the number of senators equal, Maine gets chopped off from Massachusetts and becomes a free state. And we set a line across the Louisiana Territory. Well, that's not going to hold up by 1850, by 1854, and we're going to see some changes in the laws. And I'm going to talk about those later with a different map. Let's look again at these differences between the North and the South. Some people call that sectionalism, where you put the needs of your section or your region of the country ahead of the needs of the nation as a whole. So looking again at economy, in the North, there's a mixture of industry and agriculture. It's not all agriculture. It's not all industry. In the South, it was almost all agriculture. Their lives were built around farming and plantations. Not everybody owned slaves and not everybody owned a plantation, but what drove that economy were those slave owners and their plantations. There were very few factories, mostly small farms. The American dream at that time for Southerners, like today, the American dream might be to own your own house. Well, the American dream, even for those small farmers at that point, was to someday own enough land to own slaves and to have a plantation. And so that's kind of what's driving these small farmers to back those plantation owners. It's what they wanted to be someday. And if you do away with the slave system and you do away with the plantation system, they're never going to be able to be rich and powerful like those guys are. Transportation, very different. In the North, there's lots of railroads with uniform widths of the rails. That's called a gauge. You can see that over here. The width of the tracks, how far apart are the tracks? In the North, they believed in federal government and federal government making rules and regulations to standardize things. So anywhere in the North, if you were on a train, you didn't have to worry about it. All the rails were the same distance apart. In the South, they thought that should be up to the states or the businesses who built the railroads. And so they made up their own widths. Sometimes, if you're traveling across the South, let's say you hit the state line between Mississippi and Alabama, the width of the tracks changes and you can't go on. You have to stop that train, unload all the people, unload all the cargo, move it about 100 feet forward, reload it onto a new train so it can move across the new state, and then move on. It doesn't make any sense. There were few canals, there were few improved roads. The one good advantage they had economically, transportation-wise, they had good harbors. Lots of sea travel in and out of the South. Climate played a role, like I said, whether you're slave or free, there isn't a need for enslaved labor in these northern farms. It just isn't necessary. Or in the factories, it was more expensive to keep up enslaved workers than it was just to pay a wage for people so they could go home and pay for their own food in their own house. So it didn't make sense in the North to use enslaved labor like it did in the South. What I will say is a lot of those northern states did benefit from Southern slavery, especially the textile mills where they're making clothing. The only way those people have jobs in those northern factories is because they're getting cheap cotton from the South, and the cheap cotton coming from the South is only cheap because it's being grown by enslaved labor. The crops here grow nearly year round, so if you don't want to do that work, having somebody else to do it for you may be your only option if that's something that you believe in, and the Southerners certainly did. Views of government, we've talked about this. All through the year, we've kind of brought up this idea of what's more important, liberty or security, safety or freedom. Well, one of the big questions that was being argued and still gets argued today is what I have in bold here. In the North, they believed the most important role of government was to protect individual liberty, freedom. In the South, they believed that government's main role was to protect individual property rights. And in this case, what they're talking about is the individual's right to own property in slaves. Like I said also about slavery, most people in the North in the beginning aren't opposed to slavery, but they did rely on that slave labor for cheap cotton to create jobs in the North and to keep prices low. In the South, there's that shift that I talked about where it was a necessary evil to become something that they didn't feel like they could live without. They started to view in the 1830s, instead of slaves as people, they started to view them as property. And a lot of people use religion to justify that. There are passages in the Bible like the slave must obey the master, and slavery's been around forever in every single human society. So they were using that history and that history in the Bible to justify the ownership of other people. If the Bible says slavery is okay, well, then it must be okay. A couple of other guys come up with some pretty seriously flawed theories. One of them is John C. Calhoun. He came up with something called the common good theory. He said slavery was good for both the slave and the slave owner. The slave owner got the labor. The enslaved people were taught Christianity, and therefore their souls could be saved. And so it was good for both, the slave owner and the slave. I don't think the enslaved would have agreed with John C. Calhoun. James Henry Hammond has something else called the mudsill theory. Mudsill is like a foundation. It's what a house is built on so that it doesn't crumble. And he says in every society, there's a group of people who lay the foundation. They do the dirty work, the grunt work. They get down in the dirt and they build the mudsill, the foundation. And so somebody has to be at the bottom, says James Henry Hammond. And he says, since we don't want any of the white people to be at the bottom, then we'll use these enslaved people as the mudsill. They'll be the foundation that we build our society on. And we'll talk more about James Henry Hammond and John C. Calhoun and some of this other Southern thinking and some documents in a slideshow later in the week. What I really want to get through to you is while it's partly about slave and free, there's a really, really strong element of white supremacy in all of these Southern views about slavery. It's why today, if you drive through Michigan, you see a lot of, or even Ohio, you see a lot of people with Confederate flags. Confederate battle flag is a very popular symbol. While it may not mean it to the people flying it today, that flag is and always has been, from the Civil War to its use by the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction to its reemergence during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. That flag has always been a symbol of white supremacy more than anything, more than states' rights. It's about a state's rights to create a government based on white supremacy. And you will see that in the documents that I'm going to show you later in the week. So be patient on that. And then here we have this expansion of slavery that causes a real problem between the North and the South. You can read that for yourself. I'm going to talk more about it as we go further. We talked about these compromises a little bit. Missouri, where we balanced the number of free and slave states. Missouri enters as a slave state. Maine is created, and it is a free state, and we keep the balance of power in the Senate. It's also a plan. There's a line, 3630, and anything above that line is supposed to be free of slavery. Everything below that line, slavery would be an option. Well, that works for a while, but that line only went out to the edge of the Louisiana Purchase, because in 1820, we didn't own all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That didn't happen until right after the Mexican-American War. In 1848, we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then we have another issue. What are we going to do about slavery in that new territory? California was already a state. How are we going to enter these new territories into the Union? Free or slave? Of course, Southerners wanted to expand slavery. Northerners, by this point, had reached the point where they weren't really keen on expanding slavery. They were okay with letting it go where it was, but they didn't want it to expand. So we have to compromise again. And this compromise in 1850 kind of just pushes the issue down the road a little bit. California is going to enter as a free state. That upsets the balance of power in the Senate. So if the balance of power shifts to the northern states in the Senate, what are the southern states going to get out of it? Because that's how a compromise works. Everybody gets something that they want. Well, if you read, there's no restrictions on slavery in the New Mexico territory. That's their trade-off. When New Mexico becomes a state, it's probably going to become a slave state. Down here, we have a different set of compromises. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. up until 1850. Just outside the United States Capitol building on the National Mall, people were being bought and sold in slave auctions. That is outlawed in 1850. You can no longer do that in Washington, D.C. So what's the trade-off? When we played our simulation game, the Fugitive Slave Act becomes stronger. It's no longer enough for people running away from enslavement to cross the Ohio River into northern states. The Fugitive Slave Act makes it easy for people to go north and take those people back. Now you got to get to Canada. It punishes people who help enslave people running away. So there's the trade-off on that one. And then finally, in 1854, the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise are put to the test. Kansas and Nebraska are above that 36-degree, 30-minute north latitude line in what used to be the Louisiana Territory. Kansas wants to become a state in the Union. Well, California already tipped the balance in favor of the free states. So the South isn't really willing to allow Kansas to come back in. And the argument is the Missouri Compromise was made a really long time ago, 34 years ago. We don't have to do that anymore. We're going to come up with a new rule. And the guy who fights for this is a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. And he's also going to play a major role in another slide I show you later this week. It's abandoning the Missouri Compromise. And it brings out this new term called popular sovereignty. The idea that the people who live in a state or a place should be the ones who decide for themselves if slavery should be legal or not. So we're going to vote on it. It sounds really American. The problem is Kansas is right next to Missouri, which is a slave state. So a lot of people from Missouri moved to Kansas just long enough to vote so that they could make it a slave state and they could expand slavery out into Kansas. Well, people from Illinois and other nearby free states also moved to Kansas just long enough to vote to make Kansas a free state. And when you have people who are that passionate about an issue, you're going to have violence. And so what happens is a guy named John Brown, I'm going to show you in a little bit, he's part of it. These people in Kansas who aren't really from Kansas, but they're from the other free states and slave states trying to influence this election, they started killing each other. This is 6 years before the Civil War, 7 years before the Civil War even starts. We're already killing each other over slavery in Kansas. The territory becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. So let's look at good old John Brown. That's good old John Brown right there. And if you look at him, he's got that wild hair, that big beard. He's supposed to look like somebody from the Bible. I'm sure the wheels are turning in some of your brains. Think about who freed the slaves from Egypt. It was Moses. He's supposed to look like Moses, leading the people to freedom. He's got a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. Just like Moses used his staff to part the waters of the Red Sea and lead the enslaved out of Egypt and kill Pharaoh and his army, John Brown is dividing the nation with a rifle and a Bible, and he's going to free the American slaves. You can see the storm clouds coming. This is an artist rendition. This hangs in the State House of Kansas, and they have John Brown Day in Kansas where they celebrate John Brown. You've got the United States on this side and the Confederate States on this side. The clash is coming. What did John Brown do during Bleeding Kansas? He was one of those Northerners, those abolitionists who moved out there to vote to make Kansas a free state. Well, if you think about voting, there's a couple ways to win an election. You can get more people to vote your way, or you can get fewer people to vote against you. Well, John Brown elected for the second option, and he went in a town or a farm near Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas. He and his sons drug 4 families out into their front yard and with broadswords chopped them up into pieces on their front lawn. And the message was, if you are going to support slavery, John Brown and his family and all the other abolitionists who have moved here, they're coming for you. And so it was a pretty strong message. But in the end, there are more pro-slavery people, and they vote Kansas to be a slave state. Immediately, other people who didn't want Kansas to become a free state, or a slave state, they said that election was a fraud. It's fake news. People cheated, which both sides did. And they said this election doesn't count. And they formed a different government in Kansas that was a free government that made Kansas a free state. So you have 2 different governments operating in the same place here in Bleeding Kansas. So this is where we see the first bloodshed of the war. How's this going to play out in the courts? That's what this is all about. There was a court case in 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. This is one of the major events that lead up to the Civil War too. Everybody was looking for a way to either say slavery's legal or slavery's not legal. And for a lot of people, that last option was the Supreme Court. Dred Scott was an enslaved man, enslaved by a doctor who lived in Missouri. But that doctor worked on military bases in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois. And when that doctor died, he was not in Missouri. Dred Scott traveled with him to help him. And so Dred Scott, when that doctor died, was in a free state. And he said, I'm not an enslaved person anymore. I am free. And he took his case to court. He sued for his freedom. And the Missouri Supreme Court said, you know what? You are free. You're free. You've earned your freedom here. That guy died. You're in a free state. You're free. Well, it made its way to the Supreme Court through appeals. And this was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You're going to be shocked. He was a slave owner from Maryland, a southern state, Roger Taney is his name. I know that doesn't look like Tawny, but Taney is how you say that. And he had one decision and one decision only to make. Is Dred Scott free or is Dred Scott not free? And Roger Taney in the Supreme Court decided Dred Scott indeed is not a free man, and he should go back to the widow of that doctor who had owned him before he died, who had legal ownership over him. In his will, he deeded this person who was allowed to be property by the Constitution to his wife. And Roger Taney says, Dred Scott, you got to go back to the lady. You are not a free man. But Roger Taney didn't stop there. He continued on, and he made up his mind that he was going to decide this case once and for all. Is slavery legal or is slavery not legal? We're going to have no more fights as we add new territory, because Roger Taney says slavery not only can't be banned by the federal government anywhere in the territories, it also can't be banned in the states. And so what Roger Taney basically did is he opened up slavery to be legal everywhere, including northern states who had already made laws outlawing slavery. He was basically saying those laws can't exist because slavery is legal everywhere. And he went even further than that, and he said that black people, I think he probably used the word of the time, Negroes, not only enslaved people of color, but free people of color were regarded as beings of an inferior order with no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. So it's that whole argument of white supremacy coming out again. This time it's coming from the highest court in the land. The most powerful judge in the country wrote this decision, Roger Taney. He says in a Supreme Court decision that black people and white people are different, and white people are superior and black people are inferior. And that became the law of the United States. So that's going to cause some major problems, as you might imagine, especially among the abolitionists, especially amongst people of color in the United States. And so it's not over. When Roger Taney made this decision, he thought he was solving all the problems of the United States with regards to slavery. What he was doing was making it worse. And so now both sides dig in, and there's no room for compromise anymore. There's no way to kick this down the road. It's coming. The conflict is coming. And this is kind of that final legal straw where